Hello and welcome to the Homeless Consultant channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. Coming to you today from the cheap hotel that I'm staying in for my brief vacation, as I talked about in my last video. I apologize for not having very good lighting in here. If it wasn't for this little thing blinding me in my eyes, I wouldn't have any lighting at all. If you think I can afford a hotel that actually has lights that work, you've been watching another channel. In fact, the power here usually just goes out in the middle of nowhere while I'm in the middle of getting work done. I watched a video by John Jacob Prash. He is a Christian teacher. I'm not sure where he is. I think he's in the UK. Interesting guy. Very loud. In that video, it was amazing. He brought up all these points that I had been wanting to collate into a video myself, but I didn't. So in part, I was upset that I hadn't already done it. He did it first. And in part, I was upset that there were a few dots I didn't connect. So I give him a lot of credit for this video, and I hope it is original and not just a copy of what he did. But I don't think he would mind, because this needs to be talked about. What I want to talk about is this. You know, when I started this channel 4 or 5 years ago, one of the very first things I said, and I said several times, is that one of the big problems with everything I'm talking about with Minnesotans, this cult of Minnesota, this leftist cult of Minnesota, California wannabes kind of thing. One of the problems with that is that you have got national leaders. Like right now, Senator Klobuchar. Remember Al Franken? Yeah, that was Minnesota. Oh, so was the bald wrestler, kooky guy, I can't remember his name, a wrestler. That's who Minnesotans elected. So these people are in Washington. They affect you no matter which state you live in. They affect your life. So if you think what I'm describing here only affects someone like me, you're completely wrong. More important, you've got to ask the question, if 5 or so million people can elect people like that who can have such a negative impact on your life as much as mine, those 5 million people should kind of give you a cause for alarm, wouldn't you think? And, well, those 5 million people, unless there was some election fraud, you know, unless there was some kind of fraud involved and Donald Trump actually won the state, but Minnesotans say that didn't happen, and Minnesotans are honorable people, right? So therefore, Minnesotans elected this guy president of the United States, and this little valley girl vice president of the United States. This guy who's been called the most corrupt politician in American history, the one who has so many scandals going right now that in the debates he didn't even run a campaign at the end at all. Maybe because he knew he was going to win by some other means, possibly. Most candidates run a campaign. But he had so many things, just video and documentation demonstrating, among other things, that he's owned and operated by communist China. Plus he's really old and he seems to have dementia. So he's going to be out of the picture soon. That leaves this person, this one of the nastiest, just unpleasant people who's ever been in American politics. I mean, usually you can at least try to get along. That's what politics is, right? Part of it. This is just a nasty creature. If you met this person, if this person moved in next door to you, you would just be like, oh my gosh, we got to think about moving. I can't live next to this. This is just a nasty, not going to say the word. Remember, she doesn't really have any experience doing anything. She got where she is through politics, not through doing anything. Her main accomplishment is to put more black men in prison than anyone else in San Francisco, and to keep them there beyond their terms so they can keep doing labor for the state. That's her main purpose. When he was vice president under Obama, black people had the worst unemployment. They had the worst everything. Their statistics were horrific. And we had a black president. Sort of. That's who Minnesota just elected president, unless there was some election fraud. But Minnesotans say there was no election fraud here. And Minnesotans are honorable people. So I warned about this 4 or 5 years ago, that if you don't pay attention to what I'm saying, what's going on here can affect you no matter where you live, in Hawaii, Alaska, Florida, Iowa, wherever. Because these people are dangerous, these Minnesotans. And I'm going to show you how dangerous they are when you see who they just elected. And again, I have to give a lot of credit to John Jacob Prash for kick-starting me into this, and frankly, I am taking a lot of it from his video. I will admit that. I'm not going to try to candy coat it, but I have a different audience than he does, so let's get into this. The first thing to keep in mind is that what they call the left today ain't the left that I grew up with. When I was young, we had the hippies. The hippies. I'm going to have to look over here to where it's written down. The hippie left. Now this is the left. This is the liberals. You know, remember when Norman Lear, I think it was Norman Lear, came up with All in the Family, and, you know, Archie Bunker, and he had Meathead, the liberal, and those kinds of people. Back then, the hippie, I'm going to call them the hippie left. The hippie left would debate and make rational arguments. You can watch videos of hippies in a debate setting. They have information, they've researched it, they're making rational arguments. Maybe I disagree with them, but they are at least arguments in a debate sense. And they're standing next to someone with civility and shaking hands. Today's left will not debate you. They cannot debate you. They don't know the rules of debate. They have the worst education of any generation in this country, going back to Jamestown. They don't have any knowledge. They don't research anything. And if you disagree with them, they start calling you names, and they begin their cancel culture. And I told you about that in many of my videos. So what was it? 3, 4, I think it was about 4 years ago when I told you about the kid. Yeah, when Trump was first running for president. That kid down in Lakeville said, Trump's a racist. And I said, well, could you give me one example of where Trump has done anything remotely racist, since all I've seen is photos and videos of him just hanging out with black people all over, and they seem to love him as much as he seems to love them. Would you give me one example so I could perhaps turn to your way of viewing things? And he just started shaking, and he's, well, everybody knows he's racist. And he just starts calling me names and leaves. In 2020, you've seen that all over the place, haven't you? I've been seeing it all along, because I watch these kinds of things. The hippie left. They appreciated science, but more important to them was spirituality in a sincere search for truth. They appreciated science, what science really is. But they sought the truth. Now, they might have done it in some wacky ways. They went off in all kinds of weird directions, Buddhism, but they're seeking truth. What does today's left do? Today's left has turned not science, but junk science into a religion. And nothing else will be tolerated. Junk science doesn't even attempt to find the truth. The whole purpose of junk science is to create control mechanisms, to control people's thoughts and beliefs and attitudes and behaviors, and to use it to institute laws that mandate behavior at the very least, if not thoughts, a la 1984, George Orwell. The hippie left was nonviolent. Peace, man, peace. Is today's left nonviolent? This man refused flat out in the debates to condemn the violence in this country. All President Trump asked him to do was to condemn the violence, and he refused to do it. Minnesotans just elected this man the President of the United States. Unless, of course, there was some election fraud, but Minnesotans say there was no election fraud, Minnesotans are honorable people. The hippie left had no problem with Christianity in the sense that it was another means of seeking truth. Many hippies, many of our biggest Christian leaders today were hippies. They didn't have a problem with it. Today's left not only hates Christianity, but, well, let me give an example. With the coronavirus health scare, all of these leftist governors, they're allowing liquor stores to be open, abortion clinics to be open, but not churches. They allow riots of 10, 20, 50,000 people breaking glass, shooting each other, just behaving like rabid animals, whether they're wearing a mask or not, which doesn't matter, of course, if you know anything about real science, but that's a whole other story. But today, let's see. Oh, hey, the left is violently opposed to Christianity, which is why they're shutting the churches down against the very First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, which has been respected for 244 years previously by people who are capable of respect. The hippie left used to oppose racism. They hated racism. That's one of the things. They would support Martin Luther King. They would support, well, they wouldn't support Malcolm X. Malcolm X is probably my favorite. He's not perfect, but he's about my favorite civil rights leader from that era because he was so raw, I think. And Malcolm X also said, I think he said something like, the biggest threat to black people is the white left. Kind of prophetic, isn't it? Here in 2020. Anyway, the hippie left opposed racism. The idea of the color of someone's skin being the reason you judge them. Martin Luther King said, what is it? We need to stop judging people on the color of their skin and judge them on their character. Of course, today, look at the character of so many people. I don't even care what their color is. And people accuse that of being racism. You see, today's left plays the race card. They have a deck of cards and it's all race cards. That's all it is. They have nothing to work with. They don't even know what racism is as they do it, such as Black Lives Matter. Not all lives matter, but only black ones. Oh wait, not all black ones. Not the 50 million roughly who've been murdered in their mother's womb. Not all the black people that she put into prison, because Minnesotans just elected her vice president of the United States of America. Unless there was some kind of election fraud in Minnesota. But Minnesotans say there was no election fraud. And Minnesotans are honorable people. But she put more black men in prison for a longer time than pretty much anyone else. That's her only accomplishment in her entire life that I can find. The only thing she's known for. And telling a lot of lies. So today's left is about as racist as it gets. It's reverse racism. Everything, they see color everywhere. I don't want to see color anywhere. I could care less what color your skin is. That's a DNA issue that's beyond trivial. I care about your behavior and your character. But not today's left. Everything's about race, isn't it? A little different than the hippie left. The hippie left, likewise, was opposed to segregation. You remember all those things? No Negroes allowed, no blacks allowed, whites only. That stuff was still around in parts of the country when I was born, when I was young. That's how recent it is. And the hippies hated it, and they should have. But today, what are they doing? Black Lives Matter and everyone? They're trying to segregate everybody. They want special places where only black people can be. Interesting. Not all black people, not the ones that they sent to prison or the ones that they murdered, but only some black people. The hippie left, 1967 or whatever, you're less than 20 years after McCarthyism. They were disgusted by McCarthyism. Now McCarthy on the one hand, was trying to do a good work in a way, but they were the wrong people to do it. Him and who was his cohort in that, I can't remember the guy's name anymore, but they went about it a little too gung-ho. They were doing what today you would call cancel culture, and that's just plain wrong. But sniffing out that element in society, the communist element, was a very important thing, because we're reaping the rewards today for their failure to do it properly back then in the 50s. We're getting exactly what those people in the 50s had planned for us. Because Minnesota just elected these people president and vice president of the United States. Unless there was some election fraud in Minnesota, and actually Donald Trump won it, like all the legitimate, reliable indicators seem to indicate was going to happen. But Minnesotans say there was no election fraud, and Minnesotans are honorable people. So what do we have today? Today's left, they're like McCarthyism on steroids, on meth. Cancel culture. I don't like you, therefore I'm going to call you names, I'm going to burn your house down, I'm going to... just because I disagree with you? That's who Minnesota voted for. This guy refused to condemn that. I'd also point out, again, a little bit before the hippie generation, a couple other people were socialists. One was named Adolf Hitler, another was named Joseph Stalin, another was named Fidel Castro, and there's many others. And combined, they are responsible for more slaughter of innocent civilians, not military, but members of their own population, possibly than all the murders of civilians throughout all of human history previous to the 20th century. So I guess it's kind of worth asking the burning question, do these guys have anything in common with them? Since they're socialists, especially this one, who comes right out and says she's a communist? Because Minnesotans just elected them president and vice president of the United States, you see. Unless there was some election fraud. But Minnesotans say there was no election fraud. They say they voted for this guy and that. I'm sorry, I hold women to a higher standard. Women are beautiful. That's one of the ugliest things I've ever seen in my life. In here. National Socialists Workers' Party, abbreviated as Nazi. National Socialists Workers' Party. I once had some uneducated Minnesotan ring me up on Twitter or something about saying, well, we're not nationalists. I guess I should give credit where it's due. That was some feeble attempt at a rational argument. It wasn't, but at least it was an attempt. So credit where it's due. But I don't care if it's nationalist or not. It's socialist. That's the point. What do these socialists do? What happened in Nazi Germany? What happened in Cuba? What happened in the Soviet Union? What happened with Pol Pot? How many did he murder of his own people? Was it 3 million or 6 million? I can't remember. Communist China. They still don't know the body count, and they never will. Somewhere around 50 to 80 million people, I've heard. 50 to 80 million of their own people. Communist China. The same party that this guy appears to be owned and operated by. And Minnesotans just elected this guy president of the United States of America. Unless there was some election fraud, of course. But there was no election fraud. Minnesotans say there was no election fraud. Even though 9 months ago, Governor Tim Walz, when he put the stay-at-home order in effect, in less than a month, he made an association between the severity of the coronavirus health scare and our need to engage in mail-in voting, which is the most easy way to rig an election. mail-in voting. And even though all the indicators said that Donald Trump, if there was ever someone who had a chance to win as a Republican the presidential race in Minnesota in the last 45 years, it was Donald Trump. And yet, he got his clock cleaned here. Since Minnesotans say there was no election fraud. None whatsoever. Except for the part where I wasn't allowed to vote, of course, and the part where Minnesota refuses to confirm that they have canceled my voter's registration at my previous address, which would be a net loss of 2 votes for Donald Trump. Well, 1 loss and 1 vote for this creature. Which by definition means that it was a fraudulent election in Minnesota. But hey, who's paying attention to details? By definition, it was a fraudulent election because I was denied my constitutional right to vote for Donald Trump. So what happened in Germany? What happened in communist? I mean after of course, there's no education system in Minnesota, so I don't want to have to explain what happened throughout human history since the Minnesota school system failed all these people. But to try to keep it brief, in the Russian Revolution you had the Tsar and his family, and they lived high on the hog, completely detached from the people, the peasants. Not unlike many kings throughout history, nothing terribly unusual about it. The Russian Revolution, these intellectual elites, leftists, what you would call today, Lenin and Trotsky, they come in there, raise a ruckus, they overthrow, they murder the Tsar and his family, including little Anastasia. Look that one up. And if you have a daughter of your own, think about it. Just slaughtered the Tsar and his family. Lenin took over. They had a disagreement. Trotsky fled to Mexico, and what do you know? Trotsky got assassinated in Mexico. When Lenin died, they put his body on ice and put it on display as a new idol, a religious idol, because one thing communism does is shove God, Christianity, out of the society. And then Joseph Stalin took over. And thus began the murder of countless tens of millions of Soviet people. That's just a quick overview. So what was it like for these people who ran all of these socialist communist regimes through in the early 20th century? Well, they were elitists. They would say, do as I say, not as I do. Kind of like Nancy Pelosi telling everyone to wear a mask and then being caught on camera not wearing a mask. And then she goes back on camera later and tells everyone to wear a mask. Like Cuomo out eating his ice cream on the streets, not wearing a mask. Oh, I don't know, like Michelle Obama going on television and telling everyone to stay at home. Got to keep ourselves safe. We can't socialize, even though we're a social species. Because big bad coronavirus is going to get us all. Meanwhile, as she's doing that, her husband, Barack Obama, is taking a whole entourage of Secret Service out to the golf course. Do as I say, not as I do. See, that's how elitists work. Like the leaders of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Cuba, etc., etc. Oh, let's see. Remember Nancy Pelosi with her ice cream? Showing off her super expensive ice cream and freezers in her mansion, which she somehow earned all those tens of millions of dollars, or is it hundreds of millions of dollars, I think, off a civil servant's salary. Do you work at the DMV? Did you make hundreds of millions of dollars with honest work? No corruption, no election fraud or anything like that? And interesting, gal, I just love that video from Prash. One of the things he pointed out is very apropos here. Remember in the French Revolution when they went after what they called the elitists back then, Marie Antoinette. Let them eat cake. Marie Antoinette, They're the ones taken down. They're the ones who were slaughtered. She wasn't French. She was the First Lady of France, but she wasn't French. She was Austrian. Does that sound familiar at all? With what's going on today? So what did these people do when they took over this Russia and called it the Soviet Union and started taking over all those countries that surrounded it by force while slaughtering all their people? When Hitler took over and everything, how did they do it? Well, the first thing they did was control the media. They controlled the media. The news media today, every time I go into a gas station to get gas, I have to go over and look at these idiotic rags they have in Minnesota, the Star Tribune and the Pioneer Press. Everything they say, their headlines are 180 degrees from the reality of what's actually happening in the real world. Which I know how to go out and get that information, and you should too. Just simple facts. Facts of what is actually happening. They're painting a picture where there was no election fraud in this election. But in the real world, there is so much election fraud here, it's almost incomprehensible. Except in Minnesota, of course, because Minnesotans say there was no election fraud, you see. In other words, all the Minnesotans voted for this guy. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about these kinds of people, these elitists, socialists, or in this case, communists. They control the media, because if you control the media, then the masses can't know the truth. It's impossible. In our culture, you can know the truth, unlike theirs, because they controlled all the media. In our world, we have, well, maybe this doesn't work, but if you have one of those smartphones or if you're on the internet, you can learn the truth, but you actually have to want to know the truth. And remember what I said earlier? The hippie left appreciated science, but they gave precedence to spirituality because they wanted to know the truth. Today's left worships junk science because they don't care anything about the truth. It's all about what can I get out of this science? How can I use this science to manipulate and control other people, dominate them, take control over their lives, become their dictator? How can I use it to steal their money? These regimes were corrupt to the core. The very definition of corruption. The Kremlin, bribery, graft, it was founded on corruption. All of these socialist communist regimes, every single one of them, every single one of them. And Minnesota just elected this guy president and this thing vice president, the one who calls herself a communist. And they both have socialist leanings. How about fascism? What is fascism? Antifa, whatever you want to call them, are out there whining and moaning about fascism, and yet they don't even know what fascism is. That's how bad our education system is. These boneheads name their movement after something they don't even understand in the first place. That's how stupid they are. How mind-bogglingly stupid they are. They're going after Trump as a fascist when he's the exact opposite of what a fascist is. You know who does behave like a fascist? Fascism is the incestuous relationship between corporations and government. It's when the business world becomes indistinguishable from government, such as Yahoo, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, censoring everything so that the minute the election was supposedly over and you go to YouTube, you never see another word about it. Whereas if they were telling the truth, you would see thousands of videos telling you all about the obvious, easy to document and prove election fraud that took place on November 3rd across this country. Coordinated coordinated and well-funded, well-planned, national level elections fraud. But instead you go to YouTube and what do you see? You see a cartoon, you see some, like this Minnesotan who fired a gun through a book at her boyfriend and killed him because she thought the book would stop the bullets. They see the education system in Minnesota isn't very good, you see. It just isn't very good. That's what fascism is, folks. This is fascism. That is fascism. Trump is the opposite of fascism. The corporations hate that guy. Wall Street, when they announced that this guy was supposedly the winner, which he's not, what did Wall Street do? Communist China, in a communist nation, again, there's no difference between businesses and the government because they're all state-owned. The government that owns and operates Joe Biden. The guy that Minnesotans just elected president of the United States. Unless there was some election fraud, of course, but there wasn't because Minnesotans themselves said so. And Minnesotans are honorable people. Very well educated. They tell you themselves they're very well educated. Very well educated. They know all about this stuff. They know all about the history of fascism, socialism, communism, and the amount of blood that was shed of innocent people, including children, that could fill an ocean. They know all about it, right? Because they seem to be okay with it happening again, perhaps. Or at least setting the stage for something along those lines. In those corrupt socialist communist regimes, it was impossible for the leaders to be embroiled in a scandal. So let's say that, I don't know, let's say one of the leaders was known for like constantly touching little girls all the time. Just, he liked to touch them, he liked to sniff their hair, and there might even be some evidence, like photographic evidence of something that would send an average person to prison for the rest of their life. Let's just say something like that happened. Nothing to do with this, of course. Nothing at all to do with this. In a communist socialist regime, that person would never be... How are you going to be held accountable? There's no press. The press is controlled by the leadership. The people don't know. Prior to the election, there was all kinds of information coming out about various people involved in this election who were perhaps involved in things with children, and their families might have a little incestual activity going to these kinds of things. I'm not naming names or anything like that, but in a communist socialist regime, you don't hear about it, even if it's happening. Have you heard about it since the election, by the way? Have you heard about Hunter Biden's laptop since the election? Just curious. Because you're never going to hear of it again if this guy gets in office. How about elections fraud? Is there any elections fraud in a communist, socialist, totalitarian dictatorship? Historically, yeah, there has been. Quite a bit. You ever hear of the brown shirts? You know, they're always accusing people who like Donald Trump of being brown shirts. Once again, the education system is very, very bad. But in Michigan, where all of the elections fraud was proven, hundreds of thousands of votes for Biden dumped into the system after Trump was winning. Remember, I was sitting right here on this bed looking at this monitor on an election night, and I watched Trump win in all these states, and then all of a sudden at about midnight they just stopped counting, and then about 4 hours later they start counting again, and all of a sudden all the votes are for this guy. All of a sudden. Pretty amazing, especially in Wayne County, Michigan, home of Detroit, where the electors came out and said, we're not going to certify this election, this was fraudulent. And can you guess what happened? Let's see. A bunch of brown shirts from the Democratic Party started to threaten them and their families' lives. So they changed it. They changed their vote. And they said, okay, we give up, we give in. We'll certify the election. Because the followers of these people, who Minnesotans just elected president and vice president, threatened them and their families. But you know what? There is some hope in this world, because those two electors, after that, they came out and they rescinded it. They rescinded it. They found a spine, something Republicans in legislatures across the country do not have. They found a spine, they found some morality, and they stood up and they rescinded it, and they told the world that they were threatened, pressured and threatened by the people who work with this group into certifying what they knew was a fraudulent election. Now here's the interesting thing. If you know anything about the Third Reich and how that came into power, you know, Hitler was very much against the government. You might call him an Antifa leader, just a putz. In fact, after World War I, where he was just a minor nobody, he was injured in World War I, he was working for the government. He was going to infiltrate a leftist group. He went there, and instead he found, hey, I can take this over. I can make this mine. So he betrayed his government, and he turned that into what became the Nazi Party, which became really big really fast, right? Did you ever wonder how Hitler became, in a free country with elections and everything, how did he become dictator for life and get away with that in a free country? The question might be relevant, because one of the things, if you read all of the diaries and journals and from real German citizens back then, the one thing they have in common is they say this can't happen here. It's impossible here in Germany. They were the most modern country in the world. But they were beaten down by the Treaty of Versailles, weren't they? They were beaten down, much like 2020 has done to America. So how did he become the leader for life, the Führer? Well, here's what happened. I mean, I'm jumping a bit ahead here. I think it was around 1934. This fella here, this guy is Paul von Hindenburg, one of the heroes of World War I, a German leader, statesman throughout the 20s. But he was very old and feeble. He was very old and feeble. There was a good chance he was going to die soon. Does that sound familiar at all to you? So in 1934, he wins the presidency, and he's pressured politically to reluctantly choose this guy for his chancellor. This guy's name is Adolf Hitler. Do they look like they love each other? I know these two look like they love each other, but the problem is, just a few months before he made the phone call saying, hey, would you like to be my vice president? She was running around the country screaming that this guy was a freaking sexual predator, wasn't she? Or does your memory not last that long? She was disgusted by the thought and the smell of this guy. Look at him now, all lovey-dovey. Maybe she knows something that he doesn't know, such as this. So when he became president, something had to happen to stir up the need for emergency powers in Germany. If you're going to take over in a free country, you've got to have that, what they call, quote, emergency powers. Just temporary, just for now. We'll let them go. You know, who's ever heard of somebody taking on dictatorial powers and giving it up? Or not giving it up? That's unheard of. Who's ever heard of such a thing? In politics? Who ever heard of a politician not giving up extraordinary power that they're given in an emergency situation? That's ludicrous. You know, like if, so let's say someone manufactures a health scare, a pandemic scare, for something that really isn't a whole lot different than the flu when you look at the numbers. What happened in Germany was the Reichstag burned to the ground. That's basically like the U.S. Capitol burning to the ground. They blamed a communist, but I think history has made it pretty clear that people who worked for this guy were responsible for the fire. As a result of that, this guy caved into pressure and gave emergency powers to this guy. He's the president, he's the chancellor. He gets with his goons and they come up with what today you would probably, I guess you could call it an executive order, is probably the most equivalent. Remember, according to our Constitution, only Congress can pass laws. Only Congress. A governor can't do it. Governor Tim Walz has no right in the world to tell us what to do, period. He has no right to be a dictator at all, but he can't legislate. He can't create laws that specify punishments, put you under arrest, book you, take your photo on a mugshot. He can't do that. It's called the Constitution, you see. But he got together with his goons and they did something very similar to what Governor Tim Walz did. But you know what they did? They created what you might call an executive order that said, in the event that this guy dies, remember this old feeble guy who's the president? While he's just, look at his head hanging there. He knows what's coming, doesn't he? Just like maybe someone else knows what's coming with an old and feeble person taking office. They passed an executive order that said, in the event of this guy's death, the office of president and chancellor will be merged into one. And can you guess who would be holding that office? The very next day, what a coincidence, what a coincidence. The very next day, he died. And he became the chancellor and the president. But he just gave it a new name. He called it the Fuhrer. And as they say, the rest was history. At least until history is rewritten by whoever's in control. That's why it might be kind of wise if we had leaders and if the people who ran our society cared more about truth than they did about domination and control. Because you know what? When this happened, and when this guy went berserk and started slaughtering all of Europe and started conquering and enslaving Europe, and he started building the concentration camps and the gas chambers, when he started doing that, the only thing that could stop him from taking over everything was the United States of America. The problem is, Minnesota just elected this guy and that creature, the President and Vice President of the United States of America. So if we go the same way that they did, since there's nothing but parallels, it's almost as if somebody looked to the past and said, well, let's see, that worked. That worked. That turned a free country into a totalitarian dictatorship just like that. And nobody stood up to fight against it. Nobody. They just took it, and a month later they're used to it. It's just the new normal. It's almost as if someone learned from history and they just copied it. Oh, and by the way, one other thing. Another thing that they have in common. Antifa, Black Lives Matter, you know, the people that these support, very anti-Semitic. They don't like Jews. In fact, they kind of hate Jews. Kind of like someone else did. But you know what? Back then, an awful lot of German Jews, you might even say most of them, kept saying to themselves, I'm not saying that they were favoring this person, but you read their diaries, like the diary of Anne Frank, for example. And what do they say consistently, over and over and over and over again? I'm not worried because this can't happen here. This is Germany, the most modern, powerful country in the world. It can't possibly happen here. When he died, 1936, the Holocaust basically began 2 years later. Do you have any idea how many Jewish Americans voted for this guy and that creature? And that was the most interesting thing, I think, that Jacob Prasch had to say. Something to think about. Because if you think about what's going on here, this corruption and this insanity, this incomprehensible corruption, theft of an election right in front of everyone's eyes, but the people are too stupid to just see the obvious. They've been dumbed down systematically for 50 years to the point where they don't have the ability to think rationally anymore. They don't have any critical thinking skills. They'll do things that are against their own best interests. I mean, to the point of death. Remember, owned and operated by communist China, who murdered 50 to 80 million of their own people. Minnesota elected these people president and vice president of the United States, you see. Unless there was some election fraud, of course. But Minnesotans themselves say there was no election fraud. They wanted this guy and that thing. That's what they wanted as president and vice president of the United States. Thanks for watching, and sleep well, America.